I'll leave it up to you now.
Alrighty, Dr. Josh, we've met a few times in passing. I think you were leaving a stream and I was joining a stream. My username is James is Tired. But
Okay.
my question for you is, it's Deuteronomy 32 was one you were quoting that you thought confirmed other gods. But when I went to Deuteronomy 32 and I read it, it said, Deuteronomy 32:17 said, they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods that they had never known, to new gods that had came up recently, whom the fathers had never dreamed. But when I read the Bible and I go through these, there's always
Understanding of what I'm saying. So I think the point of Deuteronomy 32 is to say what you're saying. I think the writer of Deuteronomy 32 is trying to take older traditions and, while not drastically doing away with those traditions, pull them together. For example, I think that, and this is not my area of expertise, again, I would encourage you to read Mark Smith on this or Ted Lewis. But I think what the writer is doing there is trying to equate Ale and Yahweh. There's this debate, right, in that passage about is Ale a separate deity from Yahweh and what's the text doing? I think that the writer's trying to put both of them to say this is one and the same, and not, the old Ale, gray-haired deity separate from Yahweh, giving Yahweh his inheritance. I think they're trying to equate the two. But it betrays, I think, the older tradition, the way that it has the text set up. I think you can see the older tradition in it, even though it's trying to morph it together. In the same way, I guess, that you can still see in Genesis 1 the Enuma Elish. Like if you read through the Enuma Elish, and it talks about when on high these things hadn't taken place, and then you see sort of this chaos kampf, this the cosmic battle for creation that takes place. You can still see that in Genesis 1, but they're very intentionally, I think, demythologizing that whole, the sea monster is there in the background, demythologized. So Tehom, the deep there, I think is almost certainly Tiamat, the same root that's pulling from the Enuma Elish, but it's doing it very intentionally. In this, I keep saying in the same way because I keep thinking these analogies. I think this is a good one. So just go with me for a second. There is an old Sumerian text called Ninurta and the Anzu bird. And the story is about this bird that steals what's called the Tablet of Destinies from the senior god Enlil. And he flies out into the mountains. And the gods come together and say, who's going to go fight against Anzu bird to take back the Tablet of Destinies? Because the Tablet of Destinies was this tablet that if you had it and you spoke, you could control nature, you could control the world essentially, and speak things, and things would happen. And so all the gods are too scared to go out and fight. Ultimately, Ninurta, the deity that becomes the super king god, he goes out and fights. He loses initially, and through some craftiness, he's able to win. Later on, the story, Enuma Elish, borrows, you can see it borrowing very intentionally certain phrases, certain motifs. It's very clear that it's borrowing, it's revivifying, they say, Ninurta with Marduk. But what some of the differences are, and they're very intentional differences. For example, Tiamat is this senior god, this big god that is creating all these monsters, and one of her cohorts, Kingu, has the Tablet of Destinies. And as Marduk just approaches Kingu for the first time at a distance, even though Kingu has the Tablet of Destinies, he's defeated just by Marduk's presence. Like just by him approaching, he's defeated. And so the point is that they're drawing upon the Ningirsu idea, the Ningirsu motif, the Ningirsu. They understand that people are going to know that Ninurta Ningirsu story, and they're going to hear that Marduk is approaching somebody with the tablet of destinies, and they're going to go, oh my God, Marduk's going to get his ass handed to him first. But as he approaches, just his presence, the power of his presence destroys Kingu. It's like people would go, what the? And the same thing I think is happening in the biblical text. You know, in passages like Genesis 1, somebody that reads that knows the Enuma Elish story and goes, whoa, like God doesn't even have to fight against Tiamat. He just speaks, and it's done. So it's a very intentional utilization of a genre, but in a polemic sense, in a modifying sense, to say essentially at its core, it's not your God, it's ours. Our God is the great one, if that makes sense.
What correlation have you done to link these two? Because, for example, I have a friend of mine, Chris Hansen. I haven't talked to him in a few years, but he goes hard after mythicists because they look at a lot of stories in the Middle East,
Sure.
a lot of history, and they say, okay, this had a dying and rising God, so arguably Christianity had to borrow. Now, when you look at those people, they were separated by time, vast distance, and there's no way they could ever link. So what way did you source this to link and say that the biblical text had to borrow from this?
Sure. So Chris Hansen, I really like him. We're good buddies. And I agree with him on the mythicist position. To sort of put that out, there was a book, The Golden Bough, is a Fraser, I think, that sort of did this, parallelomania is what they call it. And actually, Seth Sanders wrote on this somewhat recently, where he's trying to get at, there's a figure named Enoch, who is part of this Apkallu tradition, if you're familiar with any of that stuff, and Aitana, and he wrote this book trying to see how is it, we definitely have connections here, but how did they take place? Where did that connection take place? So it's a good question. It's sort of the $64,000 question, right? So let me back up to answer your question of how we know. The flood story, for example, there's direct correlation, for example, between verbiage that you see in Atrahasis, the Akkadian flood story from the second millennium, and what you see in the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9. And sort of some of the ways that these things go about is there's, if you look at Fraser's kind of going very broadly and going, well, you have a God that dies and then seems to come back. Well, that must be connected. Well, that's okay. I mean, we need to have a little more than that. So like Inanna being hung on a pole for 3 days, like hung on a peg, I'm not really going to make that connection. There has to be something a lot more substantial. So when you look at, for example, the Psalm, and the Psalm is escaping me which one it is, it's later, but where Yahweh is called the rider on the clouds. And I haven't looked at this in probably 6 years, that particular Psalm, but some of the language that's used there, they're hapax legomena in the Hebrew. They're words that don't appear elsewhere in Hebrew, but they're Ugaritic based. And, that's where the rider on the clouds, Baal, the rider on the clouds, comes from. And so these are some of these things are, you sort of weigh, you have some linguistic evidence that says, there's verbiage here that is a little, it's sort of like, it's sort of like looking at plagiarism. Not that they're plagiarizing, but how do you figure that out? Well, are they in the same order? Do they use sort of the same words? The more, similarity that you have between those two, the stronger of a case that you can make. You see this sort of thing, and I'll shut up, but you see this sort of thing in Exodus 21. I think David Wright wrote a book recently, 2010 maybe, where he made the comparison between the Code of Hammurabi and Exodus 21, the way that Exodus 21 is laid out. I don't know that I agree with the extent that he goes to say, well, they're actually looking at a tablet that has the Code of Hammurabi and they're ordering Exodus 21 based on that. Maybe. but there's definitely a legal tradition that stands behind that at a minimum, where you see, for example, something like the goring ox. It's hard to get around something like the goring ox, where you have the laws of Eshnuna, or the laws of Ornamu. I think it's Eshnuna though, but where it's like, man, there's so much similarity even in the verbiage here, the way and the legal rationale behind what happens, to say there's not at least a legal tradition that stands behind this that's affecting both or informing both.
I think
Made
what
any
James
sense.
is getting at,
Thank you for answering my question. I didn't want to take any more.
They were great questions.
The psalm
Great
you're
questions.
looking for is Psalm 68, if anybody wants to read it.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we need to make sure that we're careful, as James is saying, to not just go randomly connect everything and then try to import all that information. But we do want to be sensitive to it and say, if we can make that connection, how strong of a connection, and then what is this receiver text doing with it?
mm-hmm.
If any of that made any sense. I don't know.
No, it's true.